The morning light filtered through the crystalline dome of the Galactic Educational Council building as Dr. Alan Hoffman walked through the corridors carrying a simple data pad. She had worked on this proposal for months, carefully researching educational standards across 47 different species. The document in her hands contained what she believed would be a groundbreaking addition to alien schools throughout the Andromeda sector. Dr. Hoffman was one of only 12 humans working within the galactic education system, and she took her role seriously. For too long, human culture had been misunderstood or ignored entirely in academic curricula across the galaxy. Most alien students knew humans only as the newest species to join the galactic community, often viewing them as primitive newcomers who had barely mastered interstellar travel. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Human history would be integrated into existing social studies programs, starting with basic civilization development and progressing through major historical periods. She had structured it to align with standard galactic educational frameworks, ensuring easy implementation across different species' learning styles. Walking into the council chamber, Dr. Hoffman noticed the usual mix of representatives from various worlds. The Centauran delegate, a tall being with translucent blue skin, nodded politely as she passed. Near the viewing window, 3 Altarian educators discussed teaching methodologies in their melodic, chime-like language. The massive form of a draconian administrator dominated one corner of the room, his scaled hide gleaming under the artificial lighting. "Dr. Hoffman," called Director Quinn, the Etherian who oversaw curriculum development. His voice carried the characteristic whisper-soft quality of his species. "We are eager to review your submission today." She approached the central podium where a holographic display awaited her presentation. With practiced ease, she began outlining her proposal. The basic concept was straightforward. Human history offered valuable lessons in adaptation, innovation, and social development that could benefit students of all species. Human civilization demonstrates remarkable problem-solving capabilities, she explained to the assembled delegates. From early agricultural innovations to modern technological achievements, our historical progression offers excellent case studies for comparative analysis. The Centaurian representative leaned forward with interest. What specific topics would be covered in this curriculum? Dr. Hoffman activated the holographic timeline she had prepared. We would begin with the development of early human societies, examine the growth of major civilizations, and explore how humans overcame various challenges throughout their planetary history. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The Altarian educators appreciated the structured approach to cultural education. The draconian administrator praised the potential for developing better understanding between species. Even the notoriously cautious Pacifican observer expressed tentative support for the initiative. Director Quinn's ethereal form seemed to shimmer with approval. This proposal addresses a significant gap in our current educational offerings. Human integration into galactic society would benefit greatly from increased cultural awareness among younger generations. Dr. Hoffman felt a surge of excitement as the discussion continued. Several delegates asked detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. The crystalline representative inquired about translation protocols for species with different sensory capabilities. A vaporous delegate questioned how the curriculum would accommodate nonlinear temporal perception. Each concern was met with thoughtful responses and practical solutions. Dr. Hoffman had anticipated most of these issues during her months of preparation. She provided sample lesson plans, suggested assessment methodologies, and outlined training protocols for non-human instructors. The vote was unanimous. The proposal would proceed to pilot testing at 3 selected institutions across the sector. Rigel Academy, a prestigious multi-species school known for its innovative programs, volunteered to serve as the primary test site. 2 smaller institutions on frontier worlds would provide additional data points for evaluation. "We shall begin with basic historical surveys," Dr. Hoffman explained as the meeting concluded. "Simple chronological progression through major periods and developments. Nothing too complex for the initial implementation. Director Quinn expressed his satisfaction with the thorough preparation evident in the proposal. Your research into comparative educational methodologies is impressive, Dr. Hoffman. This initiative has the potential to significantly improve interspecies understanding. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, conversations continued in various languages and communication methods. The vaporous representative's excitement manifested as rapidly shifting color patterns, while the Centaurian delegation discussed logistical details in their precise, mathematical speech patterns. Dr. Hoffman gathered her materials with growing confidence. The pilot program would launch within 6 weeks, giving her time to prepare detailed lesson plans and coordinate with the participating schools. She had already identified several human historians willing to serve as guest instructors and consultants. Walking back through the corridors, she reflected on the day's success. The proposal had been accepted more readily than she had dared hope. The enthusiasm shown by representatives from such diverse species suggested that her initiative had identified a genuine need within Galactic Education. Her office overlooked the bustling administrative district where beings from hundreds of worlds conducted the daily business of galactic governance. Ships of countless designs moved through the space lanes visible beyond the atmospheric barrier, carrying students, teachers, and scholars between worlds. Dr. Hoffman began drafting implementation schedules for the pilot program. She would personally oversee the initial lessons at Rigel Academy, ensuring proper delivery of the carefully researched material. The curriculum would start with humanity's earliest civilizations, progressing through agricultural development, early technologies, and social organization. She had structured the lessons to emphasize positive aspects of human development while avoiding potentially controversial topics. The focus would remain on innovation, cooperation, and cultural achievements rather than dwelling on conflicts or difficulties. The first lesson plans covered the emergence of agriculture, the development of writing systems, and early trade networks. These topics paralleled the historical experiences of most galactic species, providing familiar frameworks for comparative analysis. By evening, Dr. Hoffman had completed preliminary schedules for all 3 pilot schools. The program would begin with introductory sessions establishing historical context and methodology. Students would learn to analyze human development patterns and compare them with their own species' evolutionary paths. As she prepared to leave her office, Dr. Hoffman felt optimistic about the project's potential impact. Better understanding between species had always been her primary motivation for joining the galactic education system. This curriculum represented a significant step toward that goal. The proposal's success exceeded her expectations, and she looked forward to seeing how alien students would respond to learning about human history and culture. Professor Tam adjusted the holographic display in classroom 7 at Rigel Academy as his mixed-species class filed in for their first human history lesson. The room contained the standard accommodation features required for multi-species education: atmospheric regulators, varied seating configurations, and translation matrices for different communication methods. 23 students, representing 8 different species, took their positions throughout the classroom. The Centaurian pupils arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns, while the Altarian students chose seats near the harmonic resonators that helped them process audio information. 3 young Draconians occupied the reinforced section, designed for larger beings, their scales reflecting the soft classroom lighting. Today we begin our exploration of human historical development, Professor Tam announced, his voice automatically translated into multiple formats. He was a Rigelian himself, chosen specifically for his reputation as a calm and methodical educator. We will start with early human settlements and agricultural practices. The first 30 minutes proceeded smoothly. Students took notes as Professor Tam described the transition from hunting and gathering to organized farming. The parallels with their own species development created comfortable discussion points. Several students asked thoughtful questions about crop selection, and seasonal planning, the problems began when the curriculum shifted to human conflict resolution and territorial disputes. Professor Tam had carefully prepared what he considered a gentle introduction to human warfare, beginning with simple tribal disagreements over resources. Humans occasionally engaged in organized combat to resolve disputes, he explained, displaying a basic tactical diagram on the holographic projector. These conflicts typically involved coordinated group movements and strategic planning. A young Pacifican student raised a tentacle-like appendage. "Professor, could you clarify what you mean by organized combat?" "Our species resolves territorial disputes through harmonic negotiation." Professor Tam activated a historical simulation showing ancient human battlefield formations. The three-dimensional display showed groups of humans, carrying weapons and moving in coordinated patterns across simulated terrain. Human warfare involved direct physical confrontation between opposing groups, often continuing until one side could no longer maintain resistance. The classroom fell silent. Several Etherian students began displaying the pale luminescence that indicated distress among their species. The Centaurian pupils had stopped taking notes and were staring at the display with visible confusion. These conflicts sometimes lasted for extended periods. Professor Tam continued, unaware of the growing unease among his students. Historical records indicate that some human wars continued for years or even decades. The first casualty was a young Centaurian named Flux, whose mathematical mind could not process the concept of deliberately prolonged conflict. His precise mental calculations were disrupted by the illogical nature of sustained warfare, causing him to collapse from cognitive overload. Professor Tam quickly moved to more specific examples. Hoping to clarify the historical context, he activated archive footage from human military museums, showing what he believed were relatively mild examples of organized human conflict. The Battle of Gettysburg. Simulation proved too much for the Altarian students, whose species had never experienced anything more violent than spirited debates over musical theory. The sight of humans deliberately charging into projectile fire while carrying sharp metal objects sent 3 of them into harmonically discordant panic responses. "Perhaps we should examine a more recent example," Professor Tam suggested, switching to archived World War II footage that he had selected for its historical significance. The grainy images of human soldiers advancing under artillery fire filled the classroom. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The Pacifican students' color-based communication system began flashing emergency distress patterns so rapidly that the translation matrix overloaded. 2 Draconian students, despite their species' reputation for military prowess, backed away from the display in obvious alarm. "These humans continue fighting even when injured," whispered one of the Etherian students, her voice barely audible above the growing chaos in the classroom. Professor Tam attempted to explain the strategic importance of the Normandy landings, but his words were lost as more students began experiencing various forms of distress. The footage showing humans wading through water under enemy fire while carrying heavy equipment caused a vaporous student to lose cohesion entirely, requiring immediate medical attention. The breaking point came when the historical footage showed wounded human soldiers refusing evacuation and continuing to fight. This concept proved incomprehensible to species that prioritized individual survival above all other considerations. "They keep going even when they are hurt," observed a crystalline student, her voice carrying notes of disbelief that the translation matrix struggled to convey. "This makes no logical sense from any survival perspective." The school's counselor, Wisp, had been called to assist with the distressed students. As an Etherian, she possessed natural empathic abilities that made her excellent at calming upset pupils. However, when she attempted to process the emotional resonance from the historical footage, her empathic senses were overwhelmed by the residual psychic imprint of human determination and sacrifice. "How many humans died in this single battle?" asked a Draconian student, his species' natural interest in military matters overriding his distress. Professor Tam consulted his notes. "Approximately 10,000 casualties during the initial assault, with total campaign losses reaching several hundred thousand." The number proved impossible for most species to comprehend in the context of voluntary combat. Wisp collapsed from empathic shock. Requiring emergency treatment from the medical staff, emergency alarms began sounding throughout Rigel Academy as multiple students required medical attention. The Centaurian pupils were experiencing calculation errors that threatened their cognitive stability. The Altarian students had created such discordant harmonics that the classroom's audio systems began malfunctioning. "Class dismissed, Professor," Tam announced, though most students had already fled the room in various states of distress. He stood alone among the overloaded translation matrices and emergency medical equipment, trying to understand what had gone wrong with his carefully planned lesson. The footage continued playing on the holographic display, showing human soldiers helping wounded comrades while under fire. To Professor Tam, it seemed like basic historical documentation. He could not understand why his students had reacted so violently to what humans considered standard military conduct. Word of the incident spread rapidly throughout the Galactic Education Network. Within hours, schools across 3 sectors had received emergency notifications about the human history curriculum. The pilot program at the other 2 test sites was immediately suspended. Pending investigation. Dr. Hoffman received the first reports while reviewing lesson plans for the following week. The descriptions of student reactions seemed exaggerated and implausible. Surely alien students could handle basic historical information without such extreme responses. The medical reports from Rigel Academy told a different story. 17 students had required treatment for various forms of psychological trauma. The school's counselor remained in intensive care, her empathic abilities damaged by exposure to human historical emotions. Emergency meetings were called across the educational bureaucracy as administrators struggled to understand how a simple history lesson had created such widespread chaos. The carefully researched curriculum that had received unanimous approval just weeks earlier was now being treated as a potential hazard to galactic educational stability. Deep within the Galactic Security Complex on Station Omega, Commander Rex reviewed the growing stack of incident reports with increasing concern. As head of the Draconian Defense Forces Intelligence Division, he had seen many unusual situations. But this particular problem defied conventional analysis. 17 students hospitalized from a history lesson, he muttered, his scaled fingers drumming against the metal desk. Either humans are deliberately hiding something dangerous, or we have seriously misunderstood what they consider normal. Across the secured conference room, Dr. Nova arranged her crystalline form to better interface with the holographic data displays. Her species possessed analytical capabilities that made them invaluable for complex investigations, though even her advanced processing power struggled with the contradictions in the reports. "The medical data indicates genuine trauma responses," she observed, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones typical of crystalline communication. These students were not pretending or overreacting. Their physiological systems registered authentic threat responses to recorded human activities. Commander Rex activated the security footage from Rigel Academy, watching the classroom chaos unfold on multiple screens. Students fleeing, medical teams responding, and Professor Tam standing confused amid the emergency equipment painted a picture that challenged everything they thought they knew about interspecies education. What exactly did they show these students? He asked, pulling up the curriculum files that Dr. Hoffman had prepared. The lesson plan appeared remarkably ordinary. Basic historical progression, agricultural development, early technologies, and conflict resolution methods? Nothing in the documentation suggested content that would traumatize students from species across the galaxy. Dr. Nova began analyzing the specific footage that had triggered the most severe reactions. The Battle of Gettysburg simulation played across her optical sensors as she processed every detail through advanced probability matrices. "Commander, these tactical movements indicate sustained combat over multiple days with casualties exceeding 30%, she reported. Yet the human forces continued fighting despite losses that would force any logical species to seek immediate negotiation. The investigation team expanded rapidly as more incidents were reported from other educational facilities. Even schools that had not implemented the human history curriculum were experiencing problems as word spread through student communication networks. A Pacifican psychologist named Wave joined the team, bringing expertise in trauma analysis and species-specific stress responses. Her preliminary findings suggested that the alien students were not simply overreacting to unfamiliar concepts, but were genuinely encountering information that their evolutionary psychology could not process. Most galactic species developed survival strategies based on conflict avoidance and resource sharing. Wave explained during the team's first formal briefing. Direct confrontation is typically reserved for immediate survival threats and ends quickly when one party demonstrates superiority. Commander Rex studied comparative data from military archives across dozens of species. The pattern was consistent. Galactic warfare involved brief, decisive encounters with minimal casualties and clear victory conditions. Prolonged conflict was considered a sign of tactical incompetence or resource scarcity. Human warfare appears to follow completely different principles, Dr. Nova observed, her analytical processes running continuously as she examined historical databases. They engage in extended campaigns despite massive casualties, often continuing combat operations under conditions that would force other species to surrender. The investigation expanded to include detailed analysis of human historical records that have been accessible to galactic databases for decades. The information had been available, but apparently no one had bothered to examine it closely enough to understand its implications. Dr. Nova's processors began identifying patterns that had been overlooked by previous researchers. Human conflicts throughout history showed consistent themes of prolonged resistance, tactical adaptation, and refusal to surrender even under seemingly impossible conditions. The siege of Stalingrad lasted for months, she reported, her voice carrying notes of disbelief that the translation system struggled to convey. Human forces continued fighting in urban ruins with minimal supplies and extreme casualties. Both sides sustained losses that exceeded the entire military capacity of most galactic civilizations. Wave's psychological analysis revealed why alien students were experiencing trauma responses. Their species had evolved complex mechanisms to avoid prolonged conflict because such behavior was evolutionarily disadvantageous. Witnessing evidence of creatures that not only survived such conflicts, but seemed to thrive in them triggered deep-seated survival instincts. Commander Rex found himself reviewing human military doctrine with growing unease. The concepts of strategic depth, acceptable losses, and fighting retreats were completely foreign to draconian military thinking. Despite his species' reputation as the galaxy's premier warriors, they planned for extended campaigns from the beginning, he observed, studying World War II strategic documents. Human military leaders expected conflicts to last for years and planned accordingly. This is not reactive desperation, but deliberate strategic thinking. The team's analysis revealed that human history contained conflict scenarios that most galactic species would classify as extinction-level disasters. Yet humans had not only survived these events but had often emerged stronger and more technologically advanced. Dr. Nova's investigation of human medical practices during warfare provided additional disturbing insights. Military medics who deliberately entered combat zones to retrieve wounded soldiers demonstrated behavior patterns that challenged basic assumptions about rational self-preservation. They risk multiple individuals to save one injured person, she reported. This strategy would rapidly deplete any military force through exponential casualty multiplication. Yet human armies consistently maintained operational effectiveness using these methods. Wave discovered that the psychological trauma experienced by alien students was not limited to warfare footage. Even civilian human activities contained elements that triggered stress responses in other species. Human endurance sports provided particularly troubling examples. Marathon running, mountain climbing, and competitive swimming all involved humans deliberately subjecting themselves to physical stress levels that would constitute torture for most galactic species they engage in these activities voluntarily for recreational purposes, Wave reported, her color patterns shifting to indicate confusion. Humans seek out physical challenges that other species would consider punishment or emergency survival situations. Commander Rex began reviewing intelligence reports from human colonies and settlements throughout the galaxy. The behavioral patterns observed in historical records appeared to be continuing in contemporary human activities. Human miners worked in conditions that required extensive life support systems, yet requested minimal safety modifications. Human explorers volunteered for reconnaissance missions in dangerous sectors without requiring significant incentive compensation. Human engineers accepted assignments involving radiation exposure that other species classified as suicide missions. The investigation team realized they were not simply dealing with historical curiosity, but with fundamental differences in species psychology that had immediate implications for galactic security and social integration. Dr. Nova's final analysis painted a picture that challenged everything the galactic community thought they understood about their newest members. Humans were not simply another technological species seeking peaceful integration. They represented something unprecedented. In galactic history, a species that had evolved to thrive in conditions that other civilizations considered unsurvivable. We need to completely reevaluate our assessment protocols for human capabilities, Commander Rex concluded. These beings are not operating within normal galactic parameters for rational behavior or survival instinct. Director Quinn floated nervously in his office as emergency reports continued flooding in from educational institutions across 17 sectors. What had begun as isolated incidents at Rigel Academy had escalated into a galactic crisis that threatened the stability of interspecies education throughout the known galaxy. The latest incident had occurred at Vega Polytechnic when a substitute teacher accidentally activated archive footage of human Olympic competitions during a cultural awareness seminar. 43 students from 12 different species required medical treatment after witnessing humans deliberately jumping over high barriers, throwing heavy objects for distance, and running until their bodies reached exhaustion. How did we miss this? Director Quinn whispered to himself, reviewing the endless stream of damage reports. Emergency response teams were being dispatched to schools that had never even implemented human history curricula. As rumors and secondhand accounts continued spreading panic among alien student populations, the Galactic Education Board convened an emergency session in the secure chambers typically reserved for war planning and planetary crisis management. Representatives from major educational institutions arrived under military escort, while medical teams stood ready to treat anyone who might be exposed to additional human cultural information. Board chairwoman Zara, a massive titan whose species normally approached problems with methodical patience, had abandoned her usual calm demeanor in favor of rapid-fire crisis management. Her booming voice echoed through the chamber as she addressed the assembled delegates. "We have 47 schools reporting student casualties from human history exposure," she announced. "Medical facilities across 9 sectors are overwhelmed with trauma cases. 3 entire educational districts have suspended operations pending psychological evaluation of their student populations." The crisis had moved beyond simple educational concerns into matters of galactic security and public safety. Intelligence reports indicated that knowledge of human historical activities was spreading through unofficial channels, creating panic among civilian populations who had previously viewed humans as harmless newcomers. Commander Rex presented his investigation findings to the emergency board, though several delegates had to be sedated when he described human warfare casualties. In clinical terms, the revelation that humans considered their own history relatively peaceful, compared to some species' potential capabilities, sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives. "We must implement immediate containment protocols," declared the Pacifican ambassador, his color patterns flashing urgent warning signals. Human cultural information poses a clear threat to galactic psychological stability. Dr. Nova's detailed analysis had revealed the scope of the problem extended far beyond military history. Human recreational activities, work practices, and Even basic survival behaviors challenged fundamental assumptions about rational species behavior that formed the foundation of galactic civilization. The first security protocols were implemented within hours of the emergency session. Any educational facility teaching human-related content would require armed security, personnel capable of managing mass casualty psychological events. Medical teams with expertise in cross-species trauma would be stationed at all locations where human history might be discussed. The protocols quickly expanded as additional incidents continued occurring. A philosophy class at Rigel University had to be evacuated when students learned that humans voluntarily read literature describing warfare, natural disasters, and personal tragedy for entertainment purposes. The concept of tragedy as recreational reading proved incomprehensible to species that had evolved elaborate mechanisms to avoid psychological distress. Military advisors recommended classifying human historical information at the same security level as classified weapons technology. The Draconian Defense Force volunteered to provide armed escorts for any educational sessions involving human cultural content. Treating the classrooms like hazardous material containment facilities, the psychological preparation requirements proved equally extensive. Students requesting access to human history courses would undergo 6 weeks of preparatory conditioning designed to minimize trauma responses to incomprehensible survival behaviors. The conditioning programs had success rates below 30%, with most alien students proving unable to mentally prepare for exposure to human historical activities. Medical preparation protocols required emergency response teams trained in species-specific trauma treatment to be present during all human history lessons. The teams needed expertise in handling cognitive overload, empathic shock, mathematical calculation errors, harmonic discord, and chromatic communication breakdown simultaneously. Dr. Hoffman watched helplessly as her simple curriculum proposal transformed into a massive security operation that resembled military mobilization more than educational planning. Her protests that human history was being unfairly sensationalized were ignored by administrators, who had witnessed the scale of student casualties firsthand. "This is completely unreasonable," she argued during a heated meeting with Director Quinn. "Humans study their own history in elementary school without requiring military supervision. These security measures are treating our culture like it contains classified weapons information." Director Quinn's ethereal form shimmered with distress as he explained the board's position. "Dr. Hoffman, we have hospitals filled with students who suffered psychological trauma from viewing what you consider basic historical documentation. The security protocols are necessary to prevent additional casualties." The situation deteriorated further when news of the educational crisis reached civilian populations throughout the galaxy. Public curiosity about the mysterious human historical information that was considered too dangerous for supervised study created underground markets for bootleg human cultural materials. Black market dealers began selling unauthorized copies of human movies, books, and historical documentaries to alien civilians who wanted to understand what made human culture so psychologically hazardous. The results were predictable. Emergency rooms across dozens of worlds began treating civilians for trauma responses to human entertainment media. A particular incident on Altair Prime became legendary among medical professionals when an entire apartment complex required evacuation after residents watched a bootleg copy of a human action movie. The concept of humans voluntarily watching entertainment that depicted violence, explosions, and death for pleasure proved so disturbing that several Altarians lost their ability to produce harmonious sounds permanently. The Galactic Health Organization issued emergency warnings about unauthorized exposure to human cultural materials, treating them like dangerous toxins that could cause irreversible psychological damage. Possession of human entertainment media was classified as a public health violation in several sectors. Security forces began conducting raids on suspected black market dealers, confiscating stockpiles of human movies, music, and literature that were being traded like illegal drugs. The irony was not lost on human observers that their species' cultural output was being treated as more dangerous than actual weapons military installations that employed Human personnel receive special security updates requiring psychological screening for alien staff who might be exposed to casual human conversations about their homeworld experiences. Several draconian officers required medical leave after humans mentioned surviving childhood activities like riding bicycles, swimming in natural water bodies, and playing contact sports. The final security protocol established restricted access zones around any location where humans discussed their personal experiences or cultural backgrounds. Alien individuals requiring access to these zones needed security clearances, typically reserved for military intelligence personnel, and hazardous materials specialists. Educational institutions began treating human history courses like advanced military training programs, complete with psychological evaluation requirements, medical monitoring, and graduated exposure protocols designed to minimize student casualties. The courses had waiting lists measured in years, as the security requirements made them accessible to only the most psychologically resilient alien students, even with all these precautions. Incidents continued occurring as creative students found new ways to access human cultural information through increasingly sophisticated methods. The galaxy's educational establishment had effectively declared war on human history while simultaneously acknowledging their inability to contain it. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council had never hosted a session quite like this one. Security forces from 6 different species maintained positions throughout the massive chamber, while medical teams stood ready to respond to potential psychological emergencies. At the center of it all, Dr. Ellen Hoffman sat at a simple podium, facing representatives from over 200 worlds who had gathered to determine the fate of human cultural education. The session had been called after 3 months of escalating incidents that had effectively paralyzed educational systems across multiple sectors. What began as a curriculum proposal had evolved into a galactic crisis that threatened the foundation of interspecies cooperation and understanding. Chairwoman Zara's massive form dominated the primary platform as she addressed the assembled delegates. Her voice carried the weight of authority built over decades of managing galactic affairs, though recent events had tested even her legendary patience. We are here to address the continuing crisis caused by human cultural information in educational settings, she announced. Dr. Hoffman has requested this forum to defend the educational value of human historical studies and to contest the security classifications currently applied to her species' cultural materials. Dr. Hoffman stood slowly, acutely aware of the medical sensors monitoring her vital signs and the security personnel tracking her every movement. The irony was not lost on her that discussing human culture now required the same precautions used for handling unstable explosive materials. Honored representatives, she began, her voice automatically translated into dozens of languages and communication methods. I stand before you to address what I believe is a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature and historical experience. The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of life support systems and monitoring equipment. Several delegates had already requested standby medical assistance in case the presentation triggered stress responses. 3 months ago, I submitted a simple proposal to include human history in standard educational curricula, Dr. Hoffman continued. The goal was to promote better understanding between species through shared learning about cultural development and historical experience. She activated a holographic display showing the original lesson plan that had triggered the first incidents at Rigel Academy. The mild historical content that had caused mass student hospitalizations appeared innocuous on the screen, yet several delegates shifted nervously in their specialized seating arrangements. What you have classified as psychologically hazardous material represents what my species considers basic historical education, she explained. Human children learn these same historical facts in elementary school without requiring military supervision or medical monitoring. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembly. The concept that human children could process information that hospitalized alien university students challenged basic assumptions about developmental psychology and educational theory. Dr. Nova, serving as a technical advisor to the proceedings, confirmed the accuracy of Dr. Hoffman's statement through her crystalline analytical networks. Human educational systems do indeed expose their young to historical information that we have classified as requiring extreme security protocols. Dr. Hoffman continued her presentation, carefully explaining that human historical experiences were not unique aberrations but rather typical examples of species development under challenging environmental conditions. The information that had traumatized alien students represented normal adaptive responses to planetary survival pressures. Earth's environment required humans to develop survival strategies that appear extreme compared to more hospitable worlds, she explained. Ice ages, natural disasters, resource scarcity, and predation pressure created evolutionary pressures that shape human behavioral patterns. The revelation began to emerge as Dr. Hoffman described Earth's environmental history. Most galactic species had evolved on worlds with stable climates, abundant resources, and minimal natural hazards. The concept of developing intelligence under constant survival pressure was foreign to species that had enjoyed millions of years of peaceful evolution. Human warfare, exploration, and risk-taking behavior represent adaptive responses to environmental challenges that most species never encountered, she continued. What you perceive as irrational aggression and dangerous risk tolerance were necessary survival traits on our homeworld. The delegates listened with growing comprehension as Dr. Hoffman explained how human cultural development reflected continuous adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The persistence and resilience that seemed incomprehensible to other species were the natural result of evolving on a world that regularly presented extinction-level challenges. Commander Rex, despite his species' military background, found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about human capabilities. The investigation had revealed that humans were not simply unusually aggressive, but rather represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization. You evolved under conditions that would be classified as a planetary disaster by our standards, he observed, his voice carrying new respect for human survival capabilities. Your entire species developed survival strategies that we only encounter during emergency military operations. The chamber erupted in confused discussions as delegates struggled to process the implications. Species that had developed peaceful civilizations over millions of years were confronting the existence of being shaped by constant environmental pressure and survival challenges. Dr. Hoffman seized the moment to address the core misunderstanding that had created the educational crisis. Human history is not unusually violent or extreme by our standards, because our entire development occurred under conditions you would consider catastrophic emergency situations. Wave, the Pacifican psychologist, provided crucial context by explaining why alien students experience trauma when exposed to human historical information. Most galactic species develop psychological mechanisms to avoid prolonged stress and conflict because such conditions were unnecessary for survival. Exposure to evidence of beings who thrived under such conditions triggers deep-seated evolutionary responses. The final revelation came when Dr. Hoffman addressed the Council's most pressing concern, whether humans represented a potential threat to galactic peace and stability. Human integration into galactic society has been peaceful because we finally found the stable, cooperative environment our species had been seeking throughout our evolutionary history, she explained. The survival traits you find disturbing were developed to overcome environmental challenges, not to threaten other species. She continued, humans consider our history pretty typical for a developing species because we have no reference point for evolution under benign conditions. We assumed all intelligent species developed under similar pressures until we encountered galactic civilization. The chamber fell completely silent as the implications became clear. Humans were not unusually aggressive or dangerous, but rather represented the first species encountered by galactic civilization that had evolved under conditions requiring extreme survival adaptations. Director Quinn's ethereal form shimmered with sudden understanding. You are saying that human behavior patterns that we find incomprehensible are actually normal responses to environmental pressures that other species never experienced. Exactly, Dr. Hoffman confirmed. What you classify as extreme survival. Behaviors were everyday necessities on Earth. Human persistence, risk tolerance, and adaptation capabilities developed because these traits were required for species survival. The Council faced an unprecedented situation: how to classify a species whose normal behavioral patterns exceeded anything in galactic experience. Not due to aggressive intent, but due to unique evolutionary pressures, Chairwoman Zara made the final pronouncement that would forever change how the galaxy classified species development. The Council recognizes that human historical and cultural information represents a new category requiring specialized classification protocols. The session concluded with the establishment of the first apex survivor species classification in galactic history. Human cultural materials would continue requiring security protocols, not because humans were dangerous, but because their evolutionary experience was so extreme that exposure to it caused psychological trauma in species that had never faced similar challenges. Dr. Hoffman left the council chambers knowing that her simple educational proposal had fundamentally changed how the galaxy understood species development and survival adaptation. Human history would remain restricted material. But now everyone understood why.